Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call together and welcome to the February 10th Governance and Priorities Committee meeting. I'd like to first recognize that we are on the traditional territory of Saneema First Nation, and our clerk today is Ms. Sheila Gert. And the question period sign-up sheet is on the desk by the computer there. If during the meeting any member of the gallery has a question regarding an agenda item, please write down your name and the agenda item on the sheet. At the start of the question period, the chair will call those who have signed up to the podium to address council. And first on our list is introduction of late items, of which I understand we don't have any.
That's correct, Chair. There's no late items.
And then I'm moving on to motion for the adoption of the agenda. So moved by Councillor Thorpe, second by Councillor Hammonds. All in favor? Opposed? It's carried. Thank you very much. And next is the adoption, motion for the adoption of the minutes as circulated. Councillor Martin, seconded by Councillor Hammonds. Thank you. Any questions, discussions? Hearing none. All those in favor? Opposed? Thank you. That's carried as well. And then we're on to reports, which I believe we're going to community wellness and livability, to be introduced by Mr. Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Council. I'm going to turn it over here in a moment to Mr. Schulberg, who's going to walk you through a brief presentation. But I wanted to set some context, and maybe more important for those members who are joining us today, and maybe people are watching online, just to understand how we got here today and what the outcomes may be of this process. So, as Council is aware, 3 weeks ago today, you were in this very room talking about topics that are of interest and timely for Council, and one of those that rose to the top of the list was neighbourhood associations, and this discussion about how the city interacts with them and how neighbourhood associations are developed and how we become aware of them. So Chris is going to walk through a little bit of that background part, just kind of setting the stage for you today on where we've been and give you some history and context there. But I think it's important to note that it's in your package under the table that talks about upcoming GPC meetings. So there is, with a date yet to be determined, there's a part 2 to this discussion that's been penciled in. And for those that are joining us today, just for your benefit, so the intent is to come back and have a second session. The format that Council's noticed of that could include inviting chairs of some of the associations to attend and be available to participate in some of that discussion, identifying what resources are available to assist with neighbourhood associations. And part of that presentation, I think, for us at the time will be to talk about how neighbourhood associations work in the city and what expectations do they have of Council, i.e. how does a neighbourhood association want to be engaged by the city. In the outcomes, Council's notice of that process would be potentially a formalized process for recognizing neighbourhood associations, new policy and criteria for associations moving forward and how they can be officially recognized by the city. But again, that is for the second part of the discussion, and today is just for that background piece. And to get us onto that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Schulberg.
Thank you very much, Dale. I have to say, I just got some new progressives recently, glasses. So if I'm blanking out or can't see something, it's because I'm trying to get used to these damn things.
Oh, thank you. I'll look forward to using that as an excuse next time.
All right, very good. So the intention here is to provide council with a short presentation on for context and situational awareness purposes of neighborhood associations here in Nanaimo and how they've been engaged and their status and how they've been engaged with by the city in the past. I just wonder if there's something I can use to, is this thing?
Yeah.
Oh, it works, all right. And of course, this is a summary of the report that council you have in your report or your agenda package. So just some quick hits. This will be fairly quick here. Neighborhood policy background. Really, this all stems back, the idea of engagement and with neighborhood groups stems back to Imagine Nanaimo in 1992, where support for neighborhoods was identified as a vital building block in the vision statement. Carried on through to Plan Nanaimo in 1994, where there was basically where we were basically the ensuing neighborhood plans that were being developed at the time reinforced this vision. And then the final point, it's a very important quote from the official community plan that currently exists, is the city will promote the establishment of neighborhood associations to support neighborhood planning initiatives. So there's been a long history of a number of decades of support for recognizing the importance of neighborhood associations and also their role to be played in planning in the community. Also, just a fun little fact that I just noticed earlier this morning as I did a word search for neighborhood in the current OCP. It's mentioned 273 times, so I think there's something to be said about the importance of that term. This, I apologize if it's a bit blurry, but this is basically a map that currently shows from our official community plan where planning areas are located in the city. Planning areas are distinct from neighborhood areas in that neighborhood areas are self-defined boundaries by the association themselves, whereas we've long ago divided the city into what are called planning areas based on census tract areas for the city. However, this map also shows where completed neighborhood plans have been created. And you'll notice it's interesting that most of the plans that we've worked on over the past 2 to 3 decades tend to be near the coast. So a lot of our things that we've done so far have been, older parts of the city, but along the coastline. And it's interesting that at some point we might want to push into the interior of the city and start looking at neighborhood plans, obviously for areas that may need to have them happen in the future will be inland. Nanaimo's neighborhood associations and their organizational structure. So currently there are 21 active neighborhood associations that we are aware of in Nanaimo.
Sorry, Chris, would you mind maybe holding the microphone or speaking up just a little bit louder? We have a headset too that might actually...
Does this work for everyone? Everybody can see at the back? Okay, will do, thanks. I might just speak to the slides as well that way rather than off my notes here. So 21 active neighborhood associations recognized by the city at this point in time, or at least we're aware of at this point in time. Various ages for these neighborhood associations. Some are 20 plus years old. Some are much more recent in formation. They are spread out through the community, and there will be a slide next that actually shows the spread of them, but they definitely are all throughout the city in different locations. As I mentioned earlier, boundaries are self-defined for these neighborhood associations, so basically the organizations themselves, the groups themselves define their areas of interest, as I like to call it. Organizational capacity varies. There'll be a slide and a few slides down that'll actually show the details of that, and you'll have that in your report. But basically, I always talk to people about thinking of neighborhood associations on a range of organizational structure, all the way from groups of very informal groups, maybe with 1 or 2 individuals still sort of keeping the fire burning for those groups, all the way up to very well-organized groups that are registered nonprofits and have formalized structure for making decisions and providing and doing work in their communities. And the final, generally collaborative relationship with some occasional exceptions, and I'll talk about that a little bit in another slide here. But generally, the relationship with the city and between the neighborhood associations themselves is generally positive. This was the map that actually shows where neighborhood associations are currently located in the city. As you can see, quite a bit of a spread throughout. I call this little area up here, this white area where no neighborhood associations exist, I always refer that to the Wild West. But basically, usually we find that associations haven't formed in newer developed areas. It takes a bit of time for those sort of efforts to start to come about. So associations tend to be in areas that are well established. I won't go into too much detail about this, but this was just an attempt to sort of categorize the different neighborhood associations and their organizational capacity. On the left, you have groups which are formally organized as registered nonprofits. Then you have next to that groups that are formally organized in some capacity with an executive regular meeting membership structure, but they don't necessarily have a nonprofit status. And then on the third column, we have groups which I call basically informal groups, not formally organized, and they may have an executive, they may have a membership, they may have regular meetings or not. They may have a combination of those, but basically we call them informal organizations.
Excuse me, Mr. Schulberg.
Oh, sure.
I have two questions now.
Sure.
Councillor Hemmons and Councillor Brown.
Sure.
Thank you, Chair, through you to Mr. Schulberg. Given that there's a relationship between the city and the neighborhood associations, is it easier from the city's perspective to liaise and support a neighborhood association that is formally organized with and registered as a nonprofit, holds an AGM, or is it just kind of across the board, the city works on par with everyone? And I don't mean necessarily we choose to work with ones who are societies, but that without structure, I'm curious, is the city able to support in the same way as those ones that aren't so well organized?
Well, traditionally, and from my own experience, we've always worked with groups, whether they're formally organized or informally organized, and it really can vary from group to group, their capacity. Being registered as a nonprofit doesn't necessarily mean that they're much better organized than some of the other groups. It's a status. It's something that they've done, and they for various reasons, and they exist under that nonprofit status. But it doesn't necessarily mean that group is easier to work with or has more capacity necessarily.
Thank you.
Organizationally, yeah.
Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you, Chair. For my own clarity, is registered nonprofit meant to be like registered society?
That's correct, yeah. And they'd be able to use the society word. The interesting thing about association is there's no legal requirement, like no legal binding for that. Like, in other words, you can use association as a name whether you're registered, for example, but you couldn't use the term society without having the society status. Thank you. And then the final group, we kind of, for years, we've kept sort of a radar where neighborhood groups have existed. Those ones on the far end are groups that once existed, no longer are considered inactive currently, but yet we do still recognize that they were out there in case someone were to come along and say, in my neighborhood, was there ever a group there? Is there a group that I can affiliate with? Well, in that case, they could potentially resurrect those groups and continue on if they had a desire to. Yeah. With regard to how the city engages with neighborhood associations, these are just some...
Excuse me for a second.
Through the chair, I know some of the audience are having trouble hearing Chris. I'm wondering if you could boost your voice a little.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. So under this list, we have responsive communication liaison role. So this is really the fundamental role that the city has had for many decades with these neighborhood groups. It's more of a communication input in from the neighborhood groups and output from us to them to keep them apprised of things that are going on that might be of interest or relevance to them. So I call it a communication conduit, and the idea there is also to build trust and familiarity with the city and the city staff that are liaising with these neighborhood groups. Conflict resolution, that is something that has occurred. As I note in the report, there were 2 instances where it perhaps was the most that had become most apparent. Oh, sorry.
We're just gonna try the headset here, Chris. It's a little bit louder.
Okay, you're going to rig me up, all right. Under my ear.
Turn it off.
There it is.
Oh, that's way better, yeah.
All right, thanks. Is this better?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Chris, you look good.
I feel like I'm getting some special consideration, need some special equipment or something. All right. Ooh, that's great. Well, I should do this all the time. This is perfect for me. All right, conflict resolution. So there has been, historically, in a few years back, there was a big issue that occurred in the Nob Hill area. You may or may not be aware of it. There was a neighborhood group, a new neighborhood group sort of wanted to form, or basically had different perspectives on how things should be done. Wanted to come in and reestablish a new version of the neighborhood group. Long story short, they basically were not getting along. I think a councillor or two were involved in the equation, and then on the other side, a councillor or two involved in the equation. Let me just call it was a bit of a schmozzle, as I like to call these things. From the staff perspective, in that case, because it was so hot and heated, we decided not to get involved in that because it really was a dispute between neighbors in that existing neighborhood. Long story short, they did. After a while, things did settle down, but what happened is one of the groups sort of melted away, and then the old group that was there originally sort of reasserted its sort of presence as the neighborhood group in that area. More recently, we have an issue with a division in the Newcastle neighborhood, and that's basically between the Newcastle Neighborhood Association and a new group that's basically have different, I think, perspectives on the effectiveness of the neighborhood groups in that area, and historically what that effectiveness has been. Right now, our hope is that the new groups could work together to try to resolve their differences. We really don't want to become arbitrators or get involved in trying, at least at a staff level, and trying to work out the differences between these groups, because we find often that's something that they just have to do themselves. So conflict resolution is not something we enter into, or if we can avoid it, and we'd rather have the neighborhood groups themselves work out the issues and then come and see us, and we'll continue on in our relationship from there. Neighborhood plan implementation and monitoring. So we have worked on various neighborhood plans over the years, and usually if there's an active neighborhood group in the area, we get them involved in the process with us. Those processes have been fairly successful. These would be like in the South End community, with South End neighborhood plan, or with the Harewood neighborhood plan, or even the Chase River neighborhood plan, those sort of places, and it's been a very positive experience overall. We have traditionally done monitoring on neighborhood plans over the years, and the idea there is every year or so to check in with the neighborhood group to actually review accomplishments made under the neighborhood plan itself. That process has worked well, but we've been inconsistent with it in the last few years. Basically, we haven't had a consistent approach to dealing with monitoring neighborhood plans at a neighborhood level for a few years. Development referral information, neighborhood groups that are on the city radar do actually get referrals on developments, and such as OCP or rezoning applications or development permits. And really that information is provided to them for information. If they have any comments, we receive those, but other than that, that's sort of the extent of that service is provided. There was more recently in 2018 a community engagement task force that was created, and the city assisted in the work that they did. There was a session devoted to neighborhood groups and doing neighborhood planning. We were involved in that, and it was a one-off event, but it was actually quite a useful event for getting the different neighborhood groups together to actually seek input from them and on different issues that were of interest to them, and sort of input that information back to the city. There were some recommendations that came out of that task force as well to suggest better ways that we could engage and ensure that we have relationship building with neighborhood groups. I won't go into the details on those right now, but basically that was a very positive process. And then leads us to 2020 OCP engagement. We definitely are looking at how we can involve neighborhood groups in the official community plan update process that will be happening in 2020 and 21. More details will be coming on that process as we get our engagement consultant involved in the project, and then you'll be hearing more details about how specifically we're going to do that sort of thing. What is Nanaimo's Neighborhood Network and how is it supported by the city? So interestingly, a network was formed in 2003, and it was actually an independent umbrella organization for neighborhood associations. It does have a mandate that basically is specified here: facilitate development of effective neighborhood associations through shared information, consultation, decision-making between associations, the city, and other organizations. Again, the whole idea here is communication building at this point in time, networking, and basically allowing the network to work amongst its members, as also have that communication conduit with the city and vice versa. The interesting thing about the network is there actually was a previous version of the Neighborhood Network that existed in the late 1990s, and through most of the mid to late 1990s it was operational. But it actually ended in the late 90s, and I think it was primarily, from my perspective, what I saw was through burnout of the volunteer members. And I know that at that time, the council in 2003 was looking back to that group and going, that was an important group that was actually very useful to have a neighborhood group out there, a neighborhood network out there that could speak to neighborhood issues, that actually supported, encouraged the neighborhood associations that were out there. So it was kind of an interesting thing. Staff then asked at that time, council at that in 2003 did ask staff go out and see if it would be possible to reform that group. And that was one of my first roles, was to go out there and meet with the neighborhood groups. We had a neighborhood forum that occurred, and we basically talked about the idea of recreating or resurrecting a neighborhood network. It was supportable by the neighborhood groups at that time. And so that was created in 2003 and has been in existence ever since. Final thing, meet 3 times a year in Sort boardroom. So we do provide this space for the use of the neighborhood network to meet 3 times a year, basically in October, February, and June. We don't charge for the space, it's just provided as a service to them. I should note, Neighborhood Networks also is very much an independent body. Even though there was encouragement from the city for them to reform, they're not considered a standing committee of council. They're completely independent from council in their operations. And we do have one staff member from the community planning section that does attend meetings as an information resource every meeting. So, and that's been going on for years. There's been that connection with city staff. I won't go into too much detail, but this is actually the Neighborhood Network's mandate and purpose statement. And they created a nice little logo way back in 2003 for the network as well. So. And the final 2 slides are related to how do other communities support and engage neighborhood associations. And it's interesting to know that many cities across Canada and in the United States and elsewhere do actually support and collaborate with neighborhood associations. Local examples that we're able to identify were District of Saanich, City of Victoria, and City of Surrey. Often there's a dedicated funding program for neighborhood associations that are provided by these communities. It's interesting. I don't know if that emanates it seems to emanate originally out of parks and rec functions for neighborhood associations and their connections sort of with community centers and that sort of thing. But basically, it's a common thing that's been in place for many places for many years. We've never had that sort of history here in Nanaimo with our neighborhood associations.
Councillor Mark.
Thank you, through the chair. There was a time when we had social planning advisory committee, and we used to actually fund certain programs for neighborhood associations.
Absolutely. There was a bit of overlap that occurred there for a number of years, which I was very happy to see that was possible for the neighborhood groups to apply for funding assistance on specific projects or things they were going to do in their neighborhood. Yeah.
So we no longer have anything like that in place?
Well, I'm not sure if I guess that's a good question, whether the current version of SPAC would still be doing that kind of funding work. I'm not aware of it in the last few years, having had any grants. There was a South End Community Association received a grant. Was that through SPAC or some version of it? It's like it might have been through Finance and Audit now.
It's one of the cultural grants.
Yeah, it's one of the it's done through the Culture and Heritage Grant Program, yes. So it kind of migrated from SPAC over into the Culture and Heritage Grant Program, yeah.
Okay.
But you're correct, it's possible. Neighborhood groups can apply for that kind of funding. It's just we haven't had a dedicated program in Nanaimo that's ever been created specifically to support neighborhood groups, either on an operational or on a project level, like you do see in other communities.
Thank you.
Mayor Pro?
Thank you very much. Just to clarify, the existence of neighborhood associations, their place in governance, et cetera, is strictly one of policy. There's no bylaw respecting them.
That's correct.
So we're just flying by the seat of our pants to some extent, without a lot of rules or guidelines as to how they should operate. And
I can say our program's been very casual for the last couple of decades. It's sort of evolved organically, and that's sort of where we're at currently.
And if I may come on the same track here, we have neighborhood associations. We also have business associations to a certain extent. Like I'm looking at the old city quarter as an example. So do we look at those in the same way, or are they different kettles of fish?
I'd say they're different kettles of fish. At least we've never affiliated. For example, a neighborhood network doesn't have business associations connected with it, so they've tended to be their own entities. So the final point, just that there's many approaches to support and engage with the neighborhood groups, but the common objective is to promote communication, citizen participation, the creation of livable neighborhoods. And that's certainly our objective at this point in time, and certainly the objective you see sort of echoed throughout different cities that do this as well. That's really, fundamentally, it's about communication. To some degree, some really talk about participatory democracy. The idea is having neighborhood groups as a vehicle for basically having citizens involved more closely in the city. So there's a bit of that you see as well. So the final chart here, and again, I won't go into too much detail about it, but basically provides District of Saanich, City of Victoria, and City of Surrey with respect to how they engage and support neighborhood groups and associations. For me, the most interesting one here, I'd say maybe the closest to the system that we have in play right now is the District of Saanich, except that they do have a dedicated grant program for neighborhoods. But other than that, they do have liaison persons through staff for that purpose. They do have, for grant funding purposes, they do have a recognition. You have to be a registered nonprofit in order to apply for the grant money. So there is that level of recognition that happens with respect to grant money. They do have an independent neighborhood network. They use the Saanich Police Department as their location for their meetings, and I believe their monthly meetings. No capacity building or training per se that they offer, and they maintain a map of neighborhood associations on their website, which is yes. The interesting one, though, is the City of Victoria, which has, again, a grant program, definitely, for neighborhood areas. But they do have a more involved liaison system, and as it's noted there, they have a counselor assigned to each recognized association as well. And I think by recognized, they do mean you have to be a registered nonprofit in the case of Victoria. Also provide neighborhood workshops as opportunity for residents to share ideas about needed community improvements with city staff. That's an interesting idea there. And each association has community association land use committees, which they call or CALETs, which facilitates dialogue between development applications and the neighborhood. So it's interesting, in our case, we simply do referrals to the neighbor group. If they have any comments to provide to us, that's provided. In this case, they have a much more, a system that's much more back and forth between the city itself and the neighborhood group, and actually have these dedicated committees that form subsets of the neighborhood associations themselves that provide input back on any development applications that are referred their way. So just a little more formalized system in that case. And I guess the city of Surrey, what I can say about that is, again, they do have a neighborhood enhancement grant program, but I believe it's open to not only associations, but other community-based groups to apply towards. As far as I could tell, they have no staff liaison person. At least I wasn't able to determine that in my research on them, but they do have required nonprofit status, required or encouraged, and they definitely do have a recognition for grant money. Again, anything that relates to grant money, generally nonprofit status is necessary for that purpose. But then as far as an independent network, it appears no meeting room provided for the network, no capacity building training, no, and maintains a map of neighborhood association areas. They do actually have that on their website. They do keep that in place.
Mayor Pro.
Thanks very much. And to expand, or do you know what recognition involved? Does it mean that, if there's a development plan, that association gets a notice, or is it simply that they're listed, or they're on a city website? What does recognition involve, as opposed to requiring registered nonprofit status, for instance?
I think, and this is maybe the difference from the city of Nanaimo, is in this case, recognition implies funding being provided to them. And consequently, most of their neighborhood groups, if not all, are registered nonprofits. I don't really have a comparison to make where would they provide information or recognize a non-registered group. That's a good question. I can't really answer that question, but all I know is that their system is built on groups that are fundamentally like 100% registered nonprofits, as far as I can tell. Yeah.
Any other questions?
All right. I think that might be the last slide, but that's the last slide. So I guess if there are any further questions, should I stay up here or sit down? Or
We have at least one.
Okay, yeah.
Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to Mr. Schulberg. I was curious about the selection of the three comparison models, and all of them had a funding component attached to them, which we currently don't have. So were there any models in your research that didn't allot funding, or is that kind of like a standard practice?
Yeah, interesting, when I was doing my checking around on what's out there, I didn't find, I couldn't find one that actually had a program per se, that didn't actually have a funding program connected with it.
Yes.
I just wanted to point out through the chair that probably the majority of cities do not have neighborhood associations. So just be aware that it's not a fait accompli at all. This is the ones that you should find.
These
A lot of cities
are comparables.
don't have them. I'm not saying that that's right or wrong.
That's a good point.
Assume that it's necessarily baked into the fabric of every municipality. So it isn't. It's depends really. There's a long history of it here, but in other cities they haven't actually matured or changed into that evolution yet. So, and I'm not sure what the percentages are, but I suspect more don't than do.
What I could add is it tends to be larger cities have well-established, like Edmonton has the League of Neighborhoods, Winnipeg has a well-established neighborhood system. Tends to be larger city. Vancouver has a neighborhood system, and they tend to be larger communities that have those more established ones. You start getting into mid-sized cities like the city and smaller, it's less common, particularly with smaller towns and cities as you go along.
So,
Having this formality.
yeah, would it be fair to say that there isn't really any legislation or anything that says that? And so if we were going to set something up, we'd be basically designing it ourselves?
I would say we'd be making a made in Nanaimo system. We could look to other examples, but there's certainly no legislative authority that lays out how best to do this. In fact, there's no legislative authority that says you even have to recognize neighborhood groups.
It would be nice.
Yeah, there you go.
Did you have your hand up, sir?
Yes. I throw this out to be slightly provocative because I see so many people here from various neighborhood associations. When I sat in at the end of the sessions around neighborhood association planning and whatnot, part of me is really excited by the prospect of active, recognized neighborhood associations that have to meet some rules and standards, numbers of members, meetings, documentation, history, finances, all the kinds of things we normally expect. I think that would, if the city was organized in every section into those associations, it would probably be very useful for neighborhood development, for communication. It would help alleviate some of the concerns that people have if they don't have a ward system, which I don't support, by the way. It has a lot of advantages. But the flip side of this is, as Mr. Rudolph has pointed out, is that we have most municipalities functioning without neighborhood associations. Some clearly have significant influence. I think of the South End Community Association that puts on the Miners' Day picnic. It's very active. It promotes a lot of things in that neighborhood. Others rise up in opposition to projects and filter it. But I mean, this was the policy established in 1992 with Imagine Nanaimo. I still have the T-shirt. But it was a very different city then. And I'm going to be very interested to hear from the neighborhood associations themselves, and it'll be the active ones who'll be participating. I don't think you're getting a one-off from the two people in some neck of the woods who are thinking about this. I'm interested in hearing what they think is the real role or value. I see them essentially as, if they're working successfully, as a sounding board, an opportunity to secure further public input on development and planning and all of those things. And one part of me says, if we can't get it organized consistently, then we shouldn't really be listening to anybody at all. And there's another part of me, it's kind of like voting. If they don't bother to vote, tough luck. They can't complain about the government. And if neighborhoods don't organize themselves into an association, tough luck, they don't get their voice heard. So I just think this is a very interesting question, but I think it's really important that people speak up about what they really think and expect out of this. Because if there isn't going to be participation enough to make these associations work effectively and provide value to council in its governance of this city, then maybe we shouldn't be bothering with this at all. If we say goodbye to Joy Leach's dream and move on, or alternatively we consider a much more formal process that I would have more confidence in terms of its contribution to the governance of the city.
Thank you for your remarks, which we'll sure to fill our inboxes tomorrow. Councillor
Thank you. So, a couple of things. First, a point of clarity. At our next yet-to-be-determined date, community associations will be invited to be at the table with us to have those conversations. So that's not, the space is not that today. I have a lot of ideas of what I would like to see, but I'm still trying to understand the current landscape. What does it look like? So we do have some very strong neighborhood associations, and when we have a new development going in, you know, we send a letter and say, do you have any feedback for us? And then that's embedded in our planning report saying the community association was contacted, no feedback. But we have associations that are 100 members strong and associations that are 5 members strong. So do we weight those pieces of feedback equally in our development decisions?
The answer would be yes. We don't make a distinction between the capacity level of the group when it responds, when we do referral letters and have to respond.
So going back then to your earlier chart of kind of what makes up our different associations, those associations may be groups which aren't formally organized. So we could potentially have 1 or 2 or 3 residents weighing in on behalf of a neighborhood, and that goes into our planning. That goes into our decision making because it ends up in a report to council. Is that accurate?
It's possible, definitely.
Okay. Okay, thank you. That's a big problem for me.
Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, I agree with Councillor Emmons. It's a problem for me if that should happen, and I'm sure in some cases it probably has happened. And I think Mayor Krogh used the word consistency, and that's unfortunately what I see lacking here in the present table. And that's nobody's fault. It's just the way things have evolved, and it's come together as we see it on that chart, which I found very interesting. That there isn't a consistent expectations of what really constitutes a neighborhood association, what we would consider is a neighborhood association, and I feel they could be such a valuable part of our consultation with the public, but to be credible, I think they have to meet certain basic minimum expectations in terms of how they're organized, how officially they're recognized, and so on. So that's where I hope this whole discussion will lead us to develop a more consistent model so that we can have confidence that when we hear from a neighborhood association, it is truly representing that neighborhood.
Yes, Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I just echo that sentiment. Even with talking with folks that may live in a particular neighborhood, you know, we received an email as well about one neighborhood association that's listed here, but no elections or no new members in a long time, and a willingness to have new members, it makes it really problematic, I would say, to have that inconsistency in representation. And so, even our official community plan, when we're talking about amendments, lays out a process for inviting we no longer have the planning committee, but for OCP amendments, it lays out a process in which members are appointed by the neighborhood association to be part of that dialogue, and so there's, I think, a wide spectrum of how we should approach this and look to maybe rectify some of these issues and add some consistency, or consistency maybe in neighborhood associations, but also consistency in process.
When you're looking at other areas and other maps, that sort of thing, other cities and municipalities, do you know if the city laid out the boundaries, or was it again organic? The reason I'm asking is I live on a little tiny strip that is a no man land between two neighborhood associations.
The Wild West.
Yeah, in the Wild West, and I can form my own neighborhood association in Beverly, and could be the majority shareholders. So, would it be, in your opinion, would it be better that we outline the areas that they're representing?
I can say from the ones that I've seen, it's hard to tell. There's no indicator of them being self-defined, but a lot of them are pretty organic looking, so I got to assume that those boundaries were probably self-defined at one point in time, and they may be rationalized so that they met if there was any gaps in between. So I wouldn't be able to answer your question directly, but it looks like most of them are probably are defined by the neighborhoods themselves over a period of decades.
And just before Councillor Turley, do they have less Wild West areas?
Yeah, well, that's a good point. Those maps that I've seen, for example, for Victoria or for Saanich or for Surrey, actually not so much Surrey. Surrey's all over the place. They got them all over the place. So those are self-defined, but the city of Victoria is 100% completely assigned. So whether that was the neighborhoods themselves that chose that, or it got sort of rationalized at some point in the history to bring them to boundaries that met with each other is another question. And then Saanich is the same way. It's pretty holistically covered with the neighborhood groups being, the territory being split up effectively 100% to neighborhood areas. So,
Councillor Turley.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to Mr. Schulberg. I guess I've been thinking about this issue of how many members are represented on the list of the different neighborhood associations, and I guess when it comes to an item that comes, let's say, a new development in that particular area, is there any way of determining from the neighborhood association about how many of the property owners in that area were actually consulted about it? Because to me, that's really the crux of it, as opposed to worrying about how many people show us representing the area. There's only two. If they contacted 200 people in the area, then it means something.
Yeah, I know that different neighborhood groups do identify the number of members they have, and also in some occasions the amount of people that are on their mailing list, their email list, or what have you. So there's definitely that. I couldn't give you like a specific number that might have been consulted for the purposes of a specific application, although I've noticed a few neighborhood groups have sort of done that. They'll check it out. It's a big one. For example, the Old City, when they had the old hospital, the Nanaimo Hospital building, that project created a lot of interest, and they were very careful about putting out notifications to ensure people were well aware of the different development process that was going on there. So you do get that sort of example, but then you have maybe on the other side of the spectrum, where it's hard to know. You get a response back, maybe a letter, maybe you don't even get any input back, and then we just assume there's no concern, so we proceed. So it's very, like I say, there's a wide range, a wide spectrum of organizational capacity there, and in some cases you see the reach out to the larger neighborhood, in other cases you don't necessarily know if that's happened or not.
I have one more, if I may. In your research, did you come up with a monetary amount that these organizations grants aside, which I would think might be fluid, I'm guessing these are capacity dollars that help them function. Do you know how much that approximately was?
Well, in the case of the District of Saanich, for example, they actually have two elements to their program. They have an operational fund and they have a project fund. And we're talking about a few $1,000s in each case that groups can apply for. So they actually, and it's actually an interesting system. I thought it could be a good example for Nanaimo as a model. Ultimately, if we were to create a grant program dedicated to neighborhood groups, the idea would be an operational fund and a project fund, because what I've heard from different neighborhood groups, sometimes there's issues with insurance that they need to get as an organization. South End's been a key one sort of for years, saying, why it would sure be helpful if there was some sort of grant money we could apply to help us offset some of that that requirement. And then on the other hand, you have a lot of groups saying, well, we'd like to do a small improvement in our park or a neighborhood or what have you. Well, we have the Volunteer in Parks program already, but these would be in addition to something like that, where they want to apply for a few thousand under the project program to do something in their neighborhood, maybe a bench at an intersection or something of that sort.
Thank you. Just one comment. It just feels important, as someone who's belonged to a neighborhood association for a number of years. Engagement goes both ways, and I know from SECA's perspective, the South End, that relationship is very positive, and that, for me, that grows engagement, right? So when a development comes into the neighborhood and the neighborhood is coordinated around having a conversation about that and figuring out their position on that, I think that definitely benefits us and helps us make our decisions, and it also benefits from a resident perspective of feeling like they know what's going on in their neighborhood, in their community. And I mean, I can say it's kind of cheeky, but Chris, everyone in the South End thinks you're our personal planner. And I think, but that speaks to the level of relationship, right? That I think a lot of South Enders know how the city works, and they know how to advocate through the system of the city because there's been that level of engagement. So I just share that to say that it goes both ways, and when it works well, it's quite something.
I mean, that's South End's probably an ideal of how the relationships could work, you know, and we have varying levels of that relationship elsewhere. It's really about, if like I can't help you on something, I'll give you the name of the person at the city that you need to talk to find out some information on this or that. I mean, it can be as simple as that. And, you know, that from a staff perspective, it's never too tiresome a process. We're talking a few hours, maybe a year, if you add it all up, where someone phones in and says from an executive, say from the South End, I need to ask someone about this question. Who do I talk to? Well, here's the person, and here's a program that we actually have going. You should be aware of it. It's that kind of engagement is about 90% of what we do, I think, engaging with neighborhood groups at this point in time.
And I think, if I may, what we often do is we think about what can neighborhood associations do for our decision making, but neighborhood associations are actually a really effective tool for simply growing awareness of how the city works, you know? So that's incredibly valuable, I think.
Yeah, and I know from a staff perspective, from my own experience, it's a good way to have situational awareness of what's going on in neighborhoods through that relationship that's built. It's valuable in that respect from a staff perspective.
Thank you very much for your presentation. That brings us up to the sort of end of number 1. Do we want to have a little update on what's going to happen at the next meeting of this one?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I think you should refresh your understanding of process here so that we can use it today as a bit of a when that might happen, what would be what was your expectations of format? I suspect that if you're looking for an opportunity for the participation, we'd have to rejig our format here a little bit and make it more organic. It's the word I use sometimes, but facilitate that. So is it presentations or is it a conversation? What would your format look like? And we could dedicate an afternoon to that or some time, or it could be some other format. So I don't know if Mr. Lindsay's got any thoughts on timing and next steps, but it'd probably be helpful to get that, like those that are taking the time to be here today and those that are watching that understand what our thinking is in terms of process and what your thinking is as well.
You have to put on the headset now.
Sorry. Mr. Chairman, I wanted to come up here because I know if I try to answer from that side, it doesn't get picked up on the microphones. So I noticed in that table is attached to your package, and that's what I was referring to this morning, kind of, those are the comments we received from council about next steps. Now, in terms of timing, your agenda is looking pretty full for the month of March, so I would suspect it would probably be April before we're back here. But going off base what I read in that document and your earlier discussions, I think that's a good time because it gives some time maybe for the neighborhood network to come together and collectively put some thought to how they want to respond to these questions, so that when they come and provide opportunity at that GPC date, if it is in April, they can participate and provide council with some feedback at that time. So I think for us, deliverables going forward and coming back to, we'll do a little bit more research on what we're seeing. Chris touched on a bit today, what we're seeing in other communities. We want to give you maybe a little bit more fulsome sense of what others are doing and how budgets are being prepared to respond to those individual situations. And then really give council some options on how you want to proceed if formalizing neighborhood networks and how we interact with them is the desire. So some options for you to think about on that day.
Councilor Brown.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. One thing I'm wondering is if I assume those options would be packaged together in the report. If there could be enough time from when that report is drafted to have that report also delivered to the different neighborhood associations, so then they can have that discussion to, sort of seeding potential options with them, and then it gives something to respond to as well, rather than maybe just creating a void where there's a lack of information, and then it might result in a lack of structure in our conversation.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's an excellent point. I think just the way the agendas are published, we probably wouldn't be able to share the report, but we can certainly share the outlines of the options that we'd be looking at or that we would have investigated, so we could have those. And I think Chris mentioned to me earlier, the next neighborhood network meeting, there's one coming up?
Yeah, end of February, like February 27th.
February 27th?
End of February, there's potential that we could participate with the network at that time and share those thoughts and get their feedback in preparation for a late March, April GPC meeting back here.
Yes, sorry, Councilor Martin.
Thank you, through the chair. So I heard you when you were saying for a meeting going forward was an Nanaimo network, and because I would like to have conversations. So what was the idea of the Nanaimo network would be able to be involved and have a conversation with us, or?
Mr. Chairman, just to clarify, I was talking about the Neighborhood Network Association. I think just given the number of different associations, I think we're best to kind of use their use the affiliated group to get an overall response, other than trying to weigh the individual responses. I think you'd find yourself in a similar situation you are now with how do you weigh different responses. So hopefully the network can work with us and we can get some feedback for council.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to point council to the screen where I've put up that matrix that's in your package and where we got to on the January 20th GPC meeting, where we talked about the part 2. So the first column is the date, which was to be determined. The topic, the third column is the background. The fourth column would be what kind of format you see, and those were some options that you had discussed. And then the last column is the outcomes, the potential outcomes of that meeting. So just as a conversation piece, if this looks like it's where you're at, that would be helpful for staff to get that feedback.
So would we use, flesh out what's in column 4 there to send out to the neighborhood association, asking them for their input ahead of time? And one thing I was always kind of keen on was getting presentations from various organizations and then council choosing the ones they wish to sit down at the table and make a formal presentation. I'm just tossing this out here. Yes?
I like the idea of the neighborhood network, of being able to bring neighborhood associations together and being able to streamline it. Otherwise, we could really take days, right? So trying to get what the various opinions are and being able to streamline it to a meeting.
Councillor Hammonds.
Thank you, Don Lauder. I actually don't want to see presentations by community associations at our next meeting. I'd like to just have a discussion of what does this mean for your association? How would you like to be engaged? Because I feel like if we, just like Zenny said, we could be there all day if we have each neighborhood, 21 neighborhood associations having 5 minutes to tell us what they've done and what they'd like to do. I think we need to get our house in order, figure out, are they something we want to formalize? How do we go about that? And I like the idea of giving some questions to the neighborhood network ahead of time to say, these are, the city is considering something like this. How would that impact you? And then use that as an invitation to the GPC, perhaps?
Councillor Thorpe and then Mayor Crowe.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm just wondering if we need 2 more steps. I'm hearing the idea that staff comes up with some options, shares it with the neighborhood network, and then comes back to us. And I'm wondering if we need to, as Councillor Hammond said, have our own discussion and do some brainstorming and consider options amongst ourselves. And then staff after that can go away and develop what they think they've heard. And whether we hear from the neighborhood associations or the network via formal presentations or just feedback that we invite, I think is important. But I guess I see the need for us to have a discussion before we go too much further and make decisions. Just my thoughts.
Mayor Crowe.
Thank you very much. To follow on what Councillor Hammond just said, to say I think it would be useful as a preliminary step to have a very short questionnaire sent to the neighborhood associations. Some very general questions. What do you see your role? Do you think it has value? Do you think the process should be a formal one, or should it be motivated by those, and if they get organized, they get recognized, and if they don't get organized, tough luck. They're not going to get much response from the city, and they're not going to be heard if they can't pull themselves together in a more formal process. I think those kinds of general questions, just to give us some feedback. Nobody's making a final decision, but I don't want us to be, on one hand, creating a solution for a problem that doesn't exist, but at the same time, if we can use it effectively and it promotes neighborhood. I mean, the South End is a strong identification. It's an historic, strong area. It has a sense of neighborhood. It promotes an important cultural activity once a year with the Miners' Day picnic. I don't know if that's going to be true with great respect of a suburban area of the town, and maybe it's not going to work. But if it works, it's wonderful. But I don't want to see beat ourselves to death if people aren't interested.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. I very much agree. I just sort of being cognizant that right now this was a preliminary conversation, and I think there's a temptation to have the conversation about neighborhood associations, but we haven't actually heard from them yet. And I think in order to make good decisions and decide if this conversation should carry on, there needs to be some sort of inclusion. My preference would be, I think, both. I think seed some of these questions, give the amount of time, a reasonable amount of time for individual neighborhood associations to talk about them, and the neighborhood network to meet and talk about them, and then come back here. We might find that folks are very happy to carry on, or we might find there's just some minor tweaks that don't involve much, or we might find that we want to go down a different route. But until we have that information and some of that conversation with the people rather than just about them, I'm not sure I would feel totally comfortable making those decisions.
Councillor Martman and Hammonds.
I just thought of something. We had a very comprehensive neighborhood association roundtables in 2018.
That's what Mr. Schulberg was referring to in his presentation.
Because there was a lot of feedback given from a lot of neighborhood associations during those periods. And it might be very helpful or useful if we had report or compilation of some of those comments as to what the neighborhood associations were looking for a year ago. That might help us with just saying going forward with our decision making.
Yes, there actually was a report that came to the previous council for review based on those sessions that were
It
held.
it was this council.
At the very beginning of our year, right?
Right.
Yeah. I believe I resent it today to you all.
Oh, did you?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, I missed downloading that. Okay.
Councillor Hemmings.
Thank you. I actually have a copy if you want to read it. The bullets are, but what, so responding to Councillor Brown's point about not having conversations without folks, I agree for the most part, but I think this is a conversation that I think we need to have some discussion on. We've had a presentation, it's very high level, we're not diving in yet. But we know that, or I personally feel, and a number of folks have said this is problematic, the way that like the status quo doesn't exactly serve us. We don't know yet if it serves the neighborhood association, so I would advocate for having a conversation amongst us. What are those gaps that we're looking to fill? Like what problems are we looking to address? And then having the conversation with the neighborhood association.
And rebuttal, Councillor Brown.
Yeah, but I very much agree, but I think that we can't have a more fulsome conversation. We might receive feedback that there's gaps that we never even thought about and that they make a lot of sense. And I think what I'm trying to say is that it would be very beneficial for that initial conversation from my perspective is, having some of that feedback as well to sort of consider and play with in my mind to sort of have that more fuller conversation about what potential next steps would be. Because I think we're very much looking at from our own experiences with neighborhood associations and our experiences, what we would want to get out of it as a councillor, as the decision-making body of the city. But there might be some very valuable input in there as well that might shape how we start to frame the discussion rather than predetermining a certain framework and then asking for feedback. That's all. I don't think I'm articulating well, but I think it is a multi-step process, and that we do need to have a conversation as a council about that. It's just I want to make sure that we have a full spectrum of inputs before getting to how we frame the discussion.
Councillor Gusselbrook.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for arriving late. I was at another committee meeting with the RDN. I initially brought forward this motion to review the neighborhood associations and a bit of discussion that we've had with a few individuals and also with folks from the neighborhood associations and a few of the neighborhood associations. And I think for me it was, how can we strengthen this network that's already there and leverage it to be useful for the upcoming OCP update? And also, from my experience within the neighborhood association, looking at how we can support strengthening the governance within them. And I know that there has been issues that have arrived depending on things with boundaries, things with governance that are there ways that we can support and how we support neighborhood associations to alleviate some of that. And maybe they aren't as large of an issue as my perception. However, I think that the discussion, we need to decide as a city how we want to best utilize the neighborhood associations. And I think in that discussion would be well served to be informed by hearing what's working and not working for the neighborhood associations so that we can have that input for issues that we haven't even thought of that may exist and how we can support them better so that information is there for when we have that discussion. So I think that if we could have a survey that went out with them, receive some information, and then at another GPC be able to sit down with that information from the neighborhood associations and then with our views and staff views on how potentially we could strengthen our support or change our support of it, I think that we get a fulsome conversation and come out of that with a bit of direction of do we want to modify how we're organizing it with the neighborhood network or levels of grant and support or that. So
I would just add, sort of trigger your thought, is I like the idea of a survey, and I think it's also important to break the survey down by folks that may not be part of the neighborhood association for some reason, because maybe not in the wild west, but if they want to be an active participant and for some reason they're not, I think that's equally as valuable information, because I think the idea here as a neighborhood association is capturing certain input around neighborhoods to get to council and also help pass on information from the city initiatives to the neighborhood. But if there's something sort of not working in that process for some of these established areas, I think it's also important to know why. Why does a citizen, they exist, because I know they do exist, because I've been contacted by at least one, two now actually, that they have a neighborhood association in their area, but in both cases, very different reasons, do not feel welcome there, right? So I think that's important information that exists outside of just consulting with those that might be part of the network or part of the currently operating association.
So trying to move this forward, I'm hearing that a survey or a questionnaire is to be sent out, or could possibly be sent out, and then we would review that at our TBD meeting, and then column 5 might be the third one.
Mr. Chairman, can I just sort of thinking out loud here while you're having this discussion? I think a couple things I'd point out is, and what I'm hearing is that maybe these statements in here, that this is the outcome, is just a little bit premature at this point, because that's kind of what we were understanding, that was the direction we were taking, but I'm hearing more, maybe there's just some more thoughtful consideration and input before we say that's the end goal. And Mr. Rudolph reminded me that we may have some capacity on March 23rd, and on that day to come back to you at sort of an interim step. So if I'm listening and hearing what council's saying, there's an opportunity to do an engagement both officially through the neighborhood network, surveys included out to the neighborhood associations, and we're talking on side here, maybe it's an opportunity to use Bang the Table to try to capture that broader discussion with the community just about neighborhood associations, and maybe for those people that are not in areas that currently have associations, trying to collect some kind of preliminary feedback on their views and thoughts towards that item. So we can come back on the 23rd, kind of have that preliminary discussion. Will have given us the opportunity to meet with the network at their meeting in February and possibly get a delegation from them, and then decide at that point how council wants to proceed on to that Thursday.
Yes, Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Chair. I'm impressed with Mr. Lindsay's ability to sum up the mood of the room, and I really endorse what he is suggesting, and I think that's a great route for us to proceed on.
From my understanding, I think the 5th column there is where we want to get eventually. This next meeting, we probably won't be doing that. And I look forward to setting up the Wild West areas, because we're looking to set up honor days in our neighborhood. We just don't know how to do it.
Is that copyright?
Yeah. So is everybody okay? We sort of made we know where things are going?
Yes.
Right? Okay. Thank you very much. I think we can move on to number 2, D2, which is the 2019-2022 strategic plan amendments.
May I'll sit down, Mr. Chair. It's not a formal presentation, and I'm one of many people that could be here speaking to any of the components of the strategic plan, but I would just put a bit of a context to the conversation. And so just as a broad reminder to those that are following, the City Council adopted a strategic plan last year, coming on as part of its 4-year mandate. And there were 4 pillars in that strategic plan, putting lands under sort of themes: livability, economic health, environmental responsibility, or governance, 4 blocks. And so as part of the governance, and that's part of what you've just been talking about, is a suggestion that council do an annual check-in on their strategic plan to verify that not only the foundations of the plan are still your principal interests and core values and so forth, but there's also an action plan that ensues from that. So back earlier in January, you had a facilitated strategic plan workshop. The minutes are attached to your package. And as part of that, each member of the council was asked to come to that meeting thinking of top issues that you wanted to discuss and that were priorities for you. And you then roundedly ended up in not a consensus mode as to any definitive issues, but you did identify a couple that became top of mind. And if depending on how you aggregate some of the similar topics, housing and homelessness and public disorder, if that was the term I think we were using, it's attached as part of the notes from the consultant in addition to the minutes of the day. That was clearly, if you aggregate those two, that would form the largest piece of the conversation, I think, for the day. There was also conversation around including public transit or a multimodal approach to transportation conversations and planning. More emphasis on that. And the third piece that I grew out of that day was the subject of facilities. Though there were other topics, and it struck me as that was something that was particularly important to you. We, at the staff level, took the conversation, looked at the document that we currently have. We had one of our staff make an attempt to iterate changes in language to the document that reflected what staff heard during the day. It becomes an exercise of wordsmithing if we get into that today in terms of interpreting that. Maybe we missed it and didn't get the right emphasis, but my ask of you is if we could focus more on a strategic level of conversation today. Are we on the right path? Is this generally okay, knowing that the business plans and a lot of actions will ensue with our various strategies and so forth over the course of the year? And we would take whatever comes out of today, if you're satisfied with it, and send it to one of the next council meetings for your approval, and that reflects the current state of the strategic plan. So, I mean, it's all on the table until it's changed, and even if it's approved at the council meeting, it always can come back. So I would apologize, I guess, for the technical nature of the sets of recommendations that you've got in front of you, because it looks like there's a lot of wordsmithing going on. And there are, and there is. And maybe we can do a better job of formatting it and linking these statements to actions and then reporting back to you on a cyclical basis on terms of our success. I noticed the RDN tomorrow has a check-in on its strategic plan, and a simple format that sort of resonates with me in terms of, just kind of keeping it alive quarterly or whatever, and checking in. But, I will say that Council's diversity of opinions and issues reflects the numerous multiplicity of issues that we are dealing with. And there's a lot of important ones, and we're trying to lift all boats at the same time, but some are more important than others. And so I think the fact that you didn't have huge consensus on a lot of, or 3 or 4 items, suggests that there's a lot of moving parts in our city. And we're trying to do a lot at the same time, and I think Council's been very patient on that. But again, I go back to the social disorder, homeless, and housing issue. It seemed to be the number one, if you aggregated those two into one thing. And we can certainly tell you, and you're aware of what active things are going on to attempt to address that, either through the Health and Housing Task Force or the police's priorities, and the superintendent is here today in case you have any questions around that, and then anything else that you may want to talk about. So I guess at the end of the day, if you're generally okay with or want to add comments or change any of the recommendations that we come out of today with direction to move forward to the council meeting and sort of complete this year's strategic plan review, and then rely more on the regular updates and business plan activities.
Okay, I have Ms. Curry and then Councilor Martin.
Well, thank you, Chair. So no, Mr. Rudolph did sum it up well. I was just going to point out that there were 11 changes, and they're noted in the recommendation to reword or add or adjust 11 different items. So were noted in the agenda, and then they're redlined in this document that I've put up on the screen for you.
Yes.
Thank you, through the chair. Being that we are a council, and I know everybody's done their homework and everybody's read through, I know this is a GPC and we may like to have a conversation, but I had no objections personally to the amendments and the capturing of this. So I personally would like to move the recommendation that council revise the 2019-2022 strategic plan with the following amendments. And if I have a seconder, we can get it on the table.
Seconded by Councillor Brown.
And as stated, I'm actually fine with the way everything's worded, but with the motion on the table, everybody has a chance.
Okay. Thank you for putting the motion on the table. Councillor Brown.
Oh, no, I just seconded.
Oh, okay. In that case, Councillor Court.
Thank you, and I want to thank Councillor Markman as well. I agree, and I'm not interested in nitpicking. I think we've had some really good in-depth discussions about our plan and our priorities, and we're on the right track. And as Mr. Rudolph says, it can always be changed or modified if we see the need to in future, but I'm happy with what's in front of me here. Thank you.
Mayor Pro.
Thank you very much, and I concur. You know, as the years roll out towards the next election, obviously things are going to surface and pop up, and we'll deal with them. And just because it's not quote unquote memorialized in writing in the strategic plan doesn't mean that things aren't going to get dealt with and problems solved and issues resolved. It's a pretty ambitious agenda, essentially, is what's laid out here. I think it's the appropriate agenda for the city. So I have no need for lengthy discussion, but I am always delighted to hear what everybody has to say.
Well, in that case, Councillor Brown.
I'm hesitant to say this, but I just want to say I think recommendation number 3 is my favorite. Add, innovate, and remove with
mine too, yeah.
Yes, Councillor.
Thank you. I really like the edits, with the exception of one. I hate to be this person, but under governance excellence, key focus area number 4, I think we tacked on a bit of a run-on sentence on that, just because we had so much discussion about safety, but I think safety appears elsewhere in the strategic plan, and I don't feel like this add-on actually says anything. It's just, you know, we're going to target our advocacy to senior levels of government on areas of mutual interest. We don't need to say for the health and safety of our residents. It just felt like a bit of a reaction to the conversation of not having public safety embedded.
Yes, Mr.
I actually disagree with Councillor Hemmons on this one. I think it's appropriate because it points out, and I think quite appropriately, on the political level, if nothing else, the awareness that we have of what we've referred to as social disorder and all the things that flow from it, and to recognize that the health and safety applies not just to those who are suffering from all kinds of issues. It's those whose lives are impacted by it in a multitude of ways. It is the topic of conversation wherever we go in our city, and I think taking it out sends a message that maybe we haven't got the message, and leaving it in, although it may not be the most elegant language in the world, I wouldn't wish to see it.
Councillor Hemmons.
Thank you. Further down in the actions under the key focus areas, we go even further and say we're going to advocate to the federal and provincial governments to take responsibility for mental health, affordable housing, and social disorder issues. And so I think we're duplicating to kind of say we heard you guys, and I don't think that's our role. I think we set our strategic plan, not use it to say we've heard all your emails.
I like duplications.
Well, I don't. Strategic plan should be clear and concise.
So we're going to suggest anything?
So how do I do that? Just an amendment?
Yes, so you would move to amend the deletion of number 4.
The amendment.
The amendment to number 4.
You want to amend the motion to remove number 4 in the recommendations.
Well, I'm actually not looking to remove number 4, I'm looking to remove the amendment to number 4.
Which is number 4 in the recommendation.
Yeah, with
Oh,
number,
sorry.
yeah,
Okay, I'm
number
looking
4,
at- okay.
yeah, number 4 in the
So
recommendation.
that,
And you would need it seconded.
Seconded by Council Brown. Here we go.
So now
Call
you're,
the question.
so you're voting on the amendment, just to be clear, you're voting on the amendment, which is to remove number 4 of the recommendations, 1 through 11.
Yes.
call the question.
Is there any more discussion?
So hold on, we're now discussing the amendment. We're now
Discussing this.
Of not having this in number
Yeah, you're
4.
voting.
Although I definitely understand where Councilor Hemmings is coming from on duplication and having things clear and concise, I do see that these documents are a communication tool to the public, as well as to us, and I think sort of reiterating that folks have been heard and that is a focus.
Now you can call the question.
Yeah, I just grammatically, I don't even think it really makes
It
sense.
doesn't.
Yeah. But as well as, well, it wasn't excluded. Right, so,
Including.
Okay. Before we go down, we do have a teacher in our midst. Nice teacher. So I'm looking for all those in favor on the amendment. All those.
Oh, I got a comment on that. I mean, grammatically, it does sound a little strange for sure. Our strategic goals and long-term, and as well as if that wasn't connected in there. So I think I would be looking
For the amendment. All right, so all those in favor of the amendment? All those opposed? Okay,
It's a tie.
It's a tie, so it fails. Okay. Next.
Mr. Chair, would you, if you allow the staff to deal with the grammatical side of that for the edit that comes back to council, we would do that, just to touch that up if there was a concern with the.
Nice middle ground.
That's a nice.
And we would highlight that modification at the council meeting, so you're aware of the exact change that we made.
That would be great, thanks.
Ian's a torn soul over here. He supports the additional language.
So now I'll call the question on the main motion.
No. Significant piece of.
I got another item.
No, I don't actually.
So, I have a couple questions in my head, and mostly it's, I see the amendments, and as an example, I'm looking actually at the document where under key focus, environmental responsibility, where the actual edit takes place. It's number 2, and we're moving the word multimodal, and I think it significantly changes that sentence, and I'm fine with the change. I just want to know, what is that going to look like going forward? Or what?
Well, I think Mr. Chair, one of the observations that I have about council here is that you've not really had the chance to talk about the multimodal transportation system. You talk often about motorized vehicles, you talk often about active transportation pedestrians, but you've never really, at this table, looked at public transportation and the integration of this, all those components as one, and how they all relate to each other, and knowing that we have a service delivery provider in the RDN, BC Transit, that is responsible for public transit, but that's not a separate lane, that's part of the system. And so I think what it means is that we need to make sure that our planning, and you see that through this USP and all these other things that come forward, there's an emphasis on bringing that into the conversation here as well as at the RDN table. So for me, it makes total sense.
Oh, and I like it as well, because to me, it actually says instead of encouraging multimodal design, we are doing multimodal design. That's what I see it as. And so as long as that's what everyone else sees.
And not to say that we're not, because we are, there's the design of roads, the relationship with the RDN staff, that there's mechanisms to ensure the integration, but this actually brings it in here as well. I think that's going to be helpful.
Good. Anybody else have any other? Yes, Councilor Gaspar.
Thank you, Chair. Just with environment responsibility, I know since the last Environment Committee discussion, there's been discussion just on reviewing sort of the overall framework of our environmental strategy, just to capture everything that we're doing and provide a framework to move forward. And I'm curious if, and from your direction here, is that something that we should look at adding as an action within environmental responsibility, or do you think, given our efforts so far, that's already been captured, it's not really necessary putting into the...
Just so, through the chair, at the last Environment Committee meeting, there was a great discussion around how all these multiplicity of initiatives that are underway tie together. And I think you're still working through that as a committee. So are you trying to make reference to that thought process in this document here?
Yeah,
it's still underway with the committee.
Yeah, it's a process underway in the committee, and I believe that it's getting the energy that it needs to, and attention, and if so, I'm just asking, do we need to capture that in the strategic plan document, or actions that we're doing that, or is it something that we can just understand is taken care of?
No, I think the question, just through to the chair, again, the committee was asking itself, knowing that all these initiatives are underway, how do they all link together? How do they, and to what direction are we moving? So we talked about the subject of climate emergency, and but how does it all kind of tie together? And what's the strategic direction that we're taking? Knowing that there's a lot of things that are associated with each other, but there was no way to describe the story of how we're moving forward. Being focused, and I think again part of the committee's mandate is to go through that and identify what are the priorities and how to figure that out. So I think you're sort of midstream on that, not even, you're just in the launching phase of that conversation. So I think really look at the outputs of the committee over the course of this year. I would anticipate we'll have a lot clearer picture of the subject of environment, the priorities, and what we're doing. So whether or not it's in here or not, I think the committee is taking that upon itself as its mandate to do that. Whether you want to have a statement in here, as the two co-chairs were at the meeting, that you feel there's some wording that you would like to add to indicate that, that's fine.
I have Councillor Martin and then Brown.
In response to Councillor Gesselp, I'm wondering if recognizing climate change and the impact on our community through our plans, strategies, bylaws, and actions doesn't actually incorporate that.
Yeah, potentially maybe Councillor Brown, other could answer that.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the thought is, and probably rightfully so, that environment is such a broad topic. And I must admit my thoughts on this are shifting as we sort of work through some problems or the issues that sort of became apparent through environmental committee meetings today, is that climate action and climate mitigation and resiliency is one aspect of the environment, just as daylighting a stream is. Daylighting a stream isn't necessarily, it may be a component of, and there may be aspects of it that are around climate action, but it's also just, whether it's fish habitat or it's environmental for different reasons. And so there's a lot of great work that has happened, continuing to happen. I think this is what Councillor Gesselp sort of alluded to, that's continuing to happen, but what's become apparent is that there's no story or narrative or framework that is tying all this together and then emphasizing some and having different weights of, with limited resources, what do you focus on, or what is the framework in which you do, and that's something I think we're working through. And I could be convinced to add it into the strategic plan, however, I just feel like we're sort of in that work, and that if we felt that at a certain time, bringing back a recommendation to council, or recommendations to council out of the environmental committee and the help of Mr. Lindsay and Mr. Rudolph, and all those others that are working on it, we can always bring it forward, and if it happens to be that we recommend the strategic plan be amended somehow, we could do that as well. But I'm just not sure we exactly know where we're going yet, and having that predetermined outcome baked in here, we might end up in a different place.
Yeah, I agree.
Just as an observation, it feels in some ways that the experience so far with the Environment Committee is not that dissimilar to the Health and Housing Task Force, where it took a little while to establish clarity on a path forward. And it's an awful lot of information attached to the environment side of things. I think the committee is behaving more like a focused task force. They're attempting to, I think one of the comments was, what's our value added? What do we need to focus on? Because there's a lot of things going on. It's not like your strategic plan where you say, not because we're not mentioning it doesn't mean we need to focus on it. There's a lot going on. So you're probably 1 or 2 meetings away from reporting back on any focus in terms of the specific mandate of working through issues with the committee. So be it climate sustainability, or if it's resiliency, or any of those topics. So inevitably this is going to come back to this council anyway, and then we report back. So I mean, it took several meetings for the task force on health and housing to try to find a path forward, and I feel it's got a strategic direction going now. And maybe take the same amount of effort on the environment group to do the same. They're anxious to do that. They're just trying to figure out their priorities.
Okay. Well, we have a motion on the floor. Any further discussion? Hearing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried unanimously. Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Councilor Mike Kessler.
Thank you, Chair. I do have a question related to the strategic plan review, but not to the motion. I'm just curious, just in terms of governance excellence and building policy framework of our governance routines. I'm just curious if there is a policy with regards to doing a strategic plan review annually that we have, or
no, Mr. Chair, through to Councilor Gusthorpe, there's no policy. It's just a recommended practice.
I'm curious, is that something that we do want? I mean, as things to bake a bit more of a governance structure in and build a policy around how we use our strategic plan to.
Good. I would recommend that you do a similar session, maybe with or without a facilitator, next January as well. But certainly can make that in as a policy and other expectations in terms of deliverables around the strategic plan. And we're working through that to continually enhance that through the linkages to business plans and various work plans that are going on. And then the accountability back through the annual reports and for individual departments and annual reports for the city. So have it all tied together. And it looked like it's flow of similar documents, so you can see how they all went together. Right now we're not doing that, but we know we need to get to doing that. For example, you'll have annual reports presented to you, I think, on the 24th from the Planning, Development, and Engineering departments, which would not necessarily look like they're part of the same set of documents, but we'll get. Those are more output documents for how many widgets we did last year.
So, just to follow up on that, so say if we as a council wanted some type of documentation or that on our policy of those linkages and the processes involved with like reviewing it annually, what would we be asking for, and where would that reside?
Well, I'd like to, firstly, we are going to be coming to council with a conversation around budget, so business plans and budgets over the second quarter of this year. So there'll be lots of conversation about, not only about how much it costs, but what are we doing? We're really here to do what we're doing, and then there's a budget envelope to accomplish that. So, and then how do we tie our business? What would be the strategic directions for departments to go away on their business plans? And that type of thing. So I think it's a bit of work in progress. And with Ms. Lagan now on board for week 4, we're now in the stage. I feel we're getting in a position where we're having those conversations about how we set the stage for this business cycle that we're going to enter into. So I would like to attach it more to that at this stage, and then so as opposed to an independent thing. But we could have a model in terms of how this all looks built into that, so you can see. Strategic plan, business plans, annual reports, performance metrics, check-ins, and that type of thing. So I think I'd like to do that as part of the business planning process. We'll be starting now, probably as early as March with you.
So I guess like I just think like when this council leaves and that we have a policy that does, you know, say that council will review a strategic plan annually. And that this is linked to this document in this cycle, so that there's a organizational process that we do follow, you know, throughout the year.
Okay, through to the chair, we are doing a complete review of all policies we need to bring to you over the course of this term. And so that could be factored into that whole thing as well. So it's all on the table. But what we have now is what we have now.
Councillor Thorpe. Oh, after Mr.
Thank you, Chair. And just to add to what Mr. Rudolph was saying, I think that once we get through this year and with Ms. Legan here and going through that whole business and budget plan cycle, we'll have a better idea of what that policy and flow should look like. Like right now, we're trying to blend them all together and do that cycle. So I think once we have a better idea and we do the policy review, we can come back to you with what that flow would look like and have you put that in place if that's what you'd like.
I really appreciate that. That's where our organization is doing. That's we're actively building this really integrated process. You know, linking the strategic plan right through to the business case and the budgeting, and I think that's wonderful. And yeah, it would be lovely at the end of it to have that articulated in a policy, so that it's something that our gift to the future generations. Yeah.
Okay. Councillor Thorpe.
And thank you, Chair. Not to be negative, because I appreciate what Councillor Geselbrecht is saying, and I don't disagree with him, but fortunately or not, no future council is bound by what policies we determine. They can change them at will. So, you know, in theory, that's a good idea, and I'd probably support it, but things change.
Councillor Geselbrecht.
Yeah. Well, I do agree with that, and I think like as a new councillor coming in, I think for a lot of new councillors, when you come into this role, you know, building into this policy of process, you know, in our onboarding to go through these policies and show that what's expected and what we should be seeing, you know, an annual review of that to make sure that we can hold staff accountable to that and that we're educated in what proper governance looks like. And I think that can help safeguard a little bit the case where, you know, nobody quite knows exactly what things should look like. They haven't been shown, and they can be misguided by a few. So, thank you.
Mayor Crowe.
With great respect, we have a recessed in-camera council meeting to return to, and we've spent an awful lot of time discussing what is essentially sticking something in a calendar to remind us to review this next year, which we all seem to agree upon. Just a comment.
Motion to adjourn.
Nice try.
Do we have anything else?
Agenda planning, E number 1.
Great.
Looks good to me.
So, I hear what you're saying. We've already dealt with Neighborhood Associations Part 2, right? So we need to add from the future DPC topics some more to our agenda so that, and flesh out them. And we're to spend the better part of a half hour doing that according to our last...
Up to. If you need it.
If we need it.
So, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure that, we just want to make sure that if this is incorrect, because it showed March 23rd as Arts and Culture, I think we had Mr. Hardy who's here that asked for that to be pushed off a little bit, was my understanding. So we have freed up some time in there, and so we come back to you with the next iteration of Neighborhood Association. Are we all clear then of what we're doing for that meeting? And that would be one of the topics. It may not take the whole meeting. Okay, so then it's...
So we would bump that up to the 23rd?
The 23rd is an iterative step to have that conversation. Then in the meantime, there's going to be engagement with Neighborhood League in the end of February and some feedback. So trying to make a bit of a process out of this. And this is, I was thinking on it, it's an entity that's been around for 28 years. It goes back to 1992. So it's good. You know, you need to take your time to do this smoothly, and so that those folks that have invested so much of their time or understand the process and are comfortable with it. After that, it's, I'm not sure if Mr. Harding has a suggested date for the arts and culture. Is it April?
Yeah. Chair, I was thinking the cultural manager are March 2nd, and the new director of recreation culture March 9th. So I was thinking, give them an opportunity to plan towards the end of April.
After that, there were a couple of smaller topics, and if there's any big ones you wish to visit.
So our next, we have March 24th filled up, then 23rd.
We need to fill it.
So we're filling that with the neighborhood association this month.
Yes, and there might be some smaller items that can be put on there as they come up. There were a couple that were noted already, election signs and...
So, Chair, just a note, going back to the January 20th meeting where we created this matrix and filled in what we have so far. We were looking at filling up the first quarter of the year, so to the end of March. We do have additional dates and topics. Some of these topics, I believe, have been decided to be dealt with in other matters, in other formats or avenues. I mean, the committee and childminding. The childminding, I think council had decided that it might be best to do that one in the council remuneration task force, looking at the childminding costs for committee members and council members. I think that's what council had kind of decided for that one. And the parity issue, we could bring them both back to this table and look at a date for those issues. We have transit on the list. We have One Port Drive on the list. So these are some future topics that we could look into the second quarter of the year or onto the third quarter of the year. So we don't need to nail down dates, but when we do, and if you want to look into the second quarter, we can find the date and then kind of work on the format and the expected outcomes council has for these topics.
Councillor Hemmons, then Brown.
Thank you. A couple of points. One, a point of clarification on the women's participation in the childminding reimbursement. My understanding of that is that we sent any conversation of council remuneration to the council remuneration task force, but I would like to see childminding or dependent minding reimbursement for volunteers of city committees, and I think that should be looped into women's participation on committees. And I also have a piece around advocacy, if I may.
Sure.
Okay, so February 24th, we're going to be discussing effective advocacy strategies, and I don't know that our outcome is a strategy per se. It might be like the previous one, where it's a down the road something if we deem it necessary. But my intention with this GPC was really to have a conversation. So we have advocacy embedded in our strategic plan. We have advocacy embedded in other policies throughout the organization. I'd like to just have a conversation of, you know, what is effective, what is not effective, how do we mobilize the community, et cetera, et cetera. And I can maybe suggest some language, Sheila, if you want afterwards, to kind of really clarify. So advocacy for public to relevant agencies or other levels of government. I'm not sure what that means. Just some clarity around that topic.
Yeah. So Chair, just to add to that, so we have, it's good that you said that because we haven't developed a strategy for you to consider. What we have done is Ms. Froke's developed a conversation piece. So the what are you advocating for and the why and the different ways of doing it and what's effective and what's not. And it really is going to be built around having that conversation amongst yourselves so we can get some direction moving forward. Like how do you want to move forward in your advocacy roles and what are your roles as council members and how do you want to advocate effectively and why and what are you advocating for and having that conversation. So I think she's worked out a good kind of presentation and it's more just for you to have that conversation piece. So hopefully that works. Ms. Froke, did you want to add anything to that, or did I pretty much sum up? Yeah.
Summed it up really.
Okay, well, may I ask a question then? We have the afternoon for this topic. In the event that we only spend 2 hours on this part, do we want to then look at development strategy, or
I think
Or is
that's
that
gonna
part
emerge
two?
from the conversation. I think we haven't had that conversation yet, so we don't know what the potential outcome is. But I can't imagine we're gonna need 3 hours to talk about effective advocacy strategies, so that might be a day to throw something else in.
We do, and it's fluid, but we've added the launch of the official community plan to your GPC on the 24th, and staff are now ready to bring that process forward to you for your information and input. So it was targeted to go to a council meeting, and we're pulling it back to the GPC so you get a chance to get your head around the scale of this. And so it's ready, the consultant's been selected, project charter has been being developed, and it would be presented to council on that day. OCP plus, I think is the term we're using for it. So there's a significant piece that's coming at that time with the engagement. So I think staff are ready to bring that forward. So that would be the perfect place. Otherwise, it's the venue for GPC, and then it can go to a council meeting, of course, it should. But here's just to make sure you're comfortable with it.
Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Worship. Thank you, Mr. Rudolph. Just going back to advocacy, because as Councillor Hemmond says, it's something that that shows up a number of times in our important documents and priorities. And my understanding, and it shows on the chart there, is that we were to get expert advice on strategies. Now, maybe that expert advice is sitting over there in the form of Ms. Faroki, and that's fine. But I was under the impression that we were going beyond our city staff for that advice.
Ms. Curry, and then Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. Just when we were working at that fourth column there, the format, those were and/ors. So it was a potential possibility to bring in expert advice. And if council wants to go in that direction, we could still go there if you're not satisfied with what we have come up with. But no, at this time, we don't have somebody lined up in that time frame as well too. It was just a month, January 20th to February 24th. So the mayor had suggested the 24th as the province has done its budget, and that would be good timing. So it was a little bit of a tight timeline.
Expert, Ms. Faroki.
I think some of you know my background, Chair to Council, is that when I worked for the federal government, I was one of the people that was responsible for greenlighting projects and initiatives. So I think it can help guide council as to what may work from an effective advocacy standpoint, especially working in the Prime Minister's Policy Department. You get lobbied hard by not just politicians, but various groups who are wanting certain things. So I put this together based on feedback that you've provided, Jake's provided, and Sheila's provided. So, and it's one of the first step conversations. And as Ms. Gray mentioned, big takeaway for us, for you to consider, is what are you advocating for and why? And from there, we can look at expanding that discussion, whether it's bringing in an expert to give you another perspective. So I hope that.
So if I may just follow up. Thank you, Chair. So let me clarify that I'm very confident in the advice and ability of Ms. Faroki, and I certainly look forward to hearing what she has to say. Thank you.
Excuse me, Councillor Hammonds.
Thank you, Chair. I actually never imagined expert advice coming in and talking to us about this. I imagined this as us identifying what we want to advocate on and using the experts in our current arena to figure out how we're going to do that. And I'll use an example from the weekend. So I was lobbied very hard, as were a few others, around a community arts space. And it would be so useful for me to say, well, council has a policy on advocacy, or we have 3 priorities that we advocate for, and this is why we choose to do those, because if you advocate for everything, you get nothing. We want to be strategic. So I'd like just a conversation, and maybe some, I don't know that we need a strategy, but we should all be on the same page, given that it's in our strategic plan. What are we advocating for? How are we doing it? What outcomes are we hoping for? What are we going to do if we don't get them?
And if I may just pop into that same thing, as I was looking at this process, is at the end of it, when an issue came to council
and it required advocacy, we already knew what we had to do, who had to write the letter, that sort of thing. So I was looking at that coming out of theirs. If something new comes up, we already know what's
That shovel-ready advocacy?
Shovel-ready advocacy, there you go. Letter already written. Okay. So that means we've filled up, oh, sorry, Councilor Grisselberg.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just adding on to like what the conversation is going to happen, Mr. Roby talked about, like, but I do see like there's one sort of the channels by which we're advocating for, but I think like really this is going to be a bit of a policy discussion on what specifically is our stance on addictions and homelessness, and what are we specifically asking for as the first step, and then getting into the tools. And I think that conversation still hasn't fully happened at the council table. So I think that's sort of like my sense that that's where it's going to be going. And in that case, that's going to require, you know, knowledgeable input on a bit more of the specifics of certain issues.
Councillor, Ms. Gurry, then Councillor Brown.
You might get a very good example of just that laid out for you on the 24th.
Councillor Brown?
Yeah, quickly on that topic, I thought the point of this session in interpretation, but what I took away was we would start to define council positions on potential topics of advocacy, preferably by motion. So councillors may have their individual thoughts, and members of council may have their individual thoughts, but on particular issues, obviously health and housing, that there's a clearly defined council position on it. But moving on, I'm wondering if, under future GPC topics, if transit and crosswalk safety can be combined into a single topic around, you know, I don't know a label, but I imagine, you know, we would talk about bus shelters, what we would like to see in terms of transit hours in future years for Nanaimo, end-of-trip facilities for pedestrians and or cyclists. Just as we have parkades, you know, we probably should have bike locks, and, you know, the name's escaping me right now. Bikeade. Yes, bikeade, sure. And that sort of conversations. I'm wondering if that could just be all at one GPC where we invite, you know, RD and transit staff, and so we can sort of look at this holistically, like we did early on, but we weren't really in decision making. Just putting that out there. The other one, we're super excited for the OCP. OCP Plus is a great name, but it really reminds me of saying in the break of Bob Iger when he took over Disney, now saying everything's going to be Disney Plus. I think it's a great brand.
Maybe it's a good analogy, I'm not sure.
But, no, it's good, it's effective, but I actually like the branding. So.
I'm not wearing Mickey Mouse here.
That's not Mickey Mouse plan.
That's Richard.
That's Richard.
Councillor Evans.
Thank you, I'll be brief. I feel like a broken record on this, and it's probably just my ignorance, but this idea that the OCP is going to be this massive engagement, and I'm really hoping we learn more about that on the 24th, but a really clear example emerged from the Neighborhood Network report today, whereby we learned during the OCP Plus, we're going to have neighborhood associations talk to us about what they'd like to see. So the more, after the 24th, I'm sure I'll have all my questions answered, but these are the types of innovations and conversations that, because I'm not a planner, I don't know they're embedded in the rewrite of the OCP, so it'll be really good to have a foundational knowledge of what are we actually going out to the community and asking them, and in what ways. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Through the chair, I think we're looking forward to coming to you. I met this morning with the consultant and the internal staff team, and I think a lot of that work is identifying the stakeholders, and I think we're trying to be very, very thoughtful about not just ticking off the normal stakeholders that we would get through a plan process. I just think we have the opportunity to do something a little different, so look forward to sharing it with you on the 24th.
So just to sum up, so we can be out of here soon. At our next GPC, we've already finalized some of the topics there. So what we should be doing is adding a new one on, so that we still keep ahead of the group here. So my suggestion is that why don't we look at transit / crosswalk safety / something, and then women's participation.
committees and task forces. I look at those two as looking a way of adding them, fleshing out those ones for at our next meeting. Anybody got any issues with those?
As combined?
Not as combined, just looking at those two possibly.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So not the same GPC for, like, combining the transit and pedestrian safety, and then combining the women participation and the child minding for volunteers, and then having all 4 of those at one meeting, or?
No.
Okay.
It was just, let's, in order, because we've got this big long list, if we could just concentrate on those 2.
So those 2 would be, you're suggesting the next 2 meetings, so the April dates then, the April dates?
Sure, and then council would come here with ideas how to flesh out the rest of the matrix at the end of the meeting. Does that work?
Just to remind council that I think the arts and culture has been moved from what was originally December to the new year, and it's been, so I think there's be some appetite to have that come as soon as it can into April.
And I think just those would be the next 2 we would add on whenever they get to. Okay. Just so we're adding something on. Okay. Anything else anybody like to bring forward? Okay, I would at this point ask a question period. Do we have any question periods? Okay.
Move for adjournment.
Councilor Markman? Mayor Crowe? Is that? All those in favor? Okay. Everybody stay around for a while. We'll have
Take a little break. 5 minutes?
Yes, and then take up to 3 o'clock. We'll come back at 3 for the rest of the other.
Thank you again.
Okay.